Hello everyone, welcome to the introduction of this cultural discourse in India. This lecture is part of your paper on media, culture and society. This lecture will introduce you to cultural discourses that shapes the contemporary reality around us. In this lecture, we will discuss the cultural variations in India. These variations have occurred due to close encounter with various external influences and encounters over thousands of years. Hence, any reading on cultural discourses in India has to be understood within the larger historical forces, intercultural contacts, the changing social structure, polity, and economy. Therefore, there are two directions that cultural discourses have taken in India. One, the colonial discourse, and the other, the nationalist discourse. To narrate both the discourses in detail, the lecture is divided into two parts. The first part deals with the colonial discourse and its variants. The second part explains the nationalist discourse and different strands within it. These two, colonial and nationalist discourses, are part of the historical approach. The other approach outlined by Professor Yogendra Singh is social science approach to cultural discourse. The colonial discourse on culture has its roots in the British colonial rule in India. The study of this discourse is crucial to understand the contemporary discussions on culture that revolve around the issue of India as a nation state. India's identity as a nation is historically unfolded by the contradictions created by the colonial rule. The colonial rule had three distinct orientations to culture in India: the missionary, the Orientalist, and the utilitarian. As the name suggests, the missionary discourse is regarding the missionaries in India. Despite the fact that it had the objective of converting people to Christianity, it gained acceptance among tribals and Dalits for a very significant reason. Therefore, it has left its lasting impression on Indian culture. It propagated the shortcomings of the Hindu religion and its customs. Specifically, missionaries took up the issue of caste system and the plight of Dalits and tribals. Missionaries denigrated the caste system and discriminatory practices and highlighted the humanitarian of untouchables. This inspired Dalits to convert to Christianity in the hope of achieving a dignified social existence. Missionary discourse is a part of colonization process so that no non-Europeans exist in the universe. It would not be an exaggeration to argue that the reform movements that emerged later in British India were inspired to an extent by the threat of missionaries' drive to gain ideological support for colonial rule through empowerment of the lower sections of the Indian society. In fact, today, these movements have become counterproductive in India. Unlike missionary discourse on culture in India, the Oriental discourse was congenial. And this was the reason it had a great acceptance among the upper strata of the society. The term Orient refers to countries of the eastern part of the world. It is defined in relation to Europe. Metonymically, Orient is used for Asian continent. The Oriental discourse relies upon the normative texts, that is, Vedas, Upanishads, to define Indian culture and tradition. It defined the Indian culture in terms of its integrity and accommodation. In other words, it emphasized on the classical text and identified the salient contributions of Indian civilization in terms of religious philosophy. They viewed the Indian culture through a comparative perspective of the West and applauded its salient and distinctive contributions. Their contributions formed the basis of a lively debate in India and abroad about the need for cultural reciprocity between East and the West. It also reinforced the forces of cultural Renaissance, and reforms in India. Going by its name, the utilitarian discourse on Indian culture is rooted in the utilitarian philosophy. The legal administrative apparatus of the British rule was guided by the philosophy of rationalism and legal positivism, which was the dominant paradigm in Britain of that time. The British rule initially tried to introduce various reformative laws to bring the Indian social system and its cultural values in tune with this philosophy. For instance, the reforms in customary laws related to sati pratha, the widow remarriage, and child marriage were some of the early attempts of British administrators to introduce codification of laws and establishment of modern judiciary in India, along with various other reforms. Since utilitarian philosophy judges every socio-cultural phenomenon with its utility, the customary laws related to sati pratha, widow remarriage, and child marriage were defined as futile, as needed to be discarded. But they failed to recognize the fact that the laws are not just governed by the principle of utility, but are embedded in the social structure itself. Therefore, colonial rulers, while introducing laws criminalizing the practice of sati pratha and child marriage and allowing widow remarriage, received strong reaction in the society. Since these practices are very much part of the Indian social structure, there were attempts to oppose such alien imposition and codification of laws. The nationalist discourse on culture is essentially an anti-colonial discourse, but not necessarily discarding all the elements of colonial discourse of culture. In fact, the interaction with colonial discourse has sapped various aspects of nationalist discourse. The sociologist Professor Yogendra Singh outlines three core features of the nationalist discourse: cultural synthesis, cultural exclusiveness, and cultural protest. Reform movements of Bengal forms the cultural synthesis discourse, as they drew the idioms from the cultural encounter between civilizations and systems of East and the West. The period between 1800 to 1940 saw remarkable cultural, social, and political renaissance in India and contributed to a variety of cultural discourses. The encounter between East and the West propelled reforms within Hindu religico-cultural and social system. It imbibed the modernizing attributes of science and technology from the West. For instance, the Brahmo Samaj movement of Ram Mohan Roy, Prarthana Samaj of Justice Ranade, Theosophical Society of Annie Besant, Ramakrishna Mission of Swami Vivekananda, and Vishwa Bharati of Rabindranath Tagore are all oriented to reforms within the Hindu religico, cultural, and social system. The cultural discourse of reform movements that promoted the idea of cultural synthesis, pranasa, and reconciliation was simultaneously giving rise to a certain kind of cultural exclusiveness based on Vedic revivalism. This means that the discourse on cultural exclusiveness was taking inspiration from Vedic traditions. It glorified the Vedic era of Indian history and constructed other socio-cultural aspects of Indian society as foreign impositions in an attempt to prove that India is not a culturally diverse country but belongs to the Hindus. One of the core aspects of this Vedic revivalism was to thwart any religious conversion to Christianity. For instance, the Arya Samaj movement led by Swami Dayanand Saraswati had various socio-cultural elements in its ideology. Although the Arya Samaj movement to an extent questioned and rejected the ritualistic Hinduism, but it still relied heavily on an exclusive Hindu identity. Similarly, Swami Vivekananda also relied ideologically on the preservation of exclusionary Hindu identity. Sri Aurobindo also reiterates through his writings reliance on Gita, Vedas and Upanishads to define core aspects of Indian civilization and its continuity. He was building up an indigenous model of modernization supposedly different from colonial modernity. While we have treated both dimensions of nationalist discourses separately, one must not see them as entirely two separate domains. There are overlaps in both cultural synthesis and cultural exclusiveness discourses. As we have already discussed, the Orientalist discourse announced the reliance on and interest in Vedic literature in mapping the essential elements of Indian civilization. Both these discourses carry this commonality to some extent. Although the reform movements propelling cultural synthesis have challenged many orthodox practices, so for instance sati pratha, child marriage, and advocated widow remarriage, they did not entirely reject colonial modernity, as was the case with Vedic revivalist discourse. The reform movements didn't initiate a violent extermination of Christians, they rather at times worked in association with them. Contrary to this reliance and glorification of Vedic literature, there emerged another discourse of cultural protest, which was also inherently nationalistic but antithetical to the Brahminical moorings of the Vedic literature. For instance, Jyotiba Phule, B.R. Ambedkar, E.V. Ramaswamy, Naikar are those who led the anti-Brahminical movement. They all contested the centuries-old exploitation of the caste system. For them, the Vedic literature and Vedic era is not a social order to be glorified because it was full of norms and practices, victimizing the lowest strata, including women and tribals in India. So they exposed a countercultural discourse that challenged both the colonial and the nationalist discourse, and their characterization of Indian society is essential a Hindu society. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar located the essence of this counter-ideology to Brahminical discourse in what is called Buddhism. Ramaswamy launched a staunch critique of Hinduism and caste system. Jyotiba Phule, along with Savitribai Phule, advocated education for women, including upper caste women, and opened schools for them. Well, it is argued that the nationalist discourse and culture, which was supposed to be anti-colonial, was in reality an urge of traditional high caste elites to consolidate and strengthen their cultural dominance. In fact, the modern Indian history cannot be read without the debate between Ambedkar and Gandhi. For Ambedkar, Gandhi's cultural discourse relied on the Varna Ashram Dharma that didn't allow Dalits to have any kind of freedom. He also criticized Gandhi's ideas of bringing Ram Rajya by throwing out the colonial rulers. The cultural protest discourse seeks to democratize the whole social order and emancipate Dalits, tribals, minorities, and of course, women. The voices of cultural protest were coming from women, including upper caste women, who denounced Hinduism. The social science approach is of a later origin in India. Its origin lies mainly in social science disciplines of social anthropology, sociology, and other branches of social sciences. The distinctiveness of social science approach is that it is oriented towards scientifically verifiable empirical phenomenon, thereby emphasizing on field work and ethnographic studies. Its focus is upon the observation of the cultural practices, values, beliefs, and cultural artifacts within a community or an ethnic group in both the objective and subjective or the manifest and latent forms. Well, based on the empirical evidences, social science approach infers generalizations about social phenomena. It also makes cross-cultural comparisons to bring about cultural relativity of any socio-cultural system. Therefore, in this approach, notions of nation and civilization are constructions that can be analyzed with the help of cultural observation of facts. So in this way, it is influenced by certainly the Western social sciences. Singh also remarks that ideologically, the Indian social science studies have repudiated several major assumptions of the Western social science construction of Indian society and culture, such as its assumption to present the Indian society and its culture by overemphasizing its structural diversities as manifested by caste, tribes, ethnicities, languages, regions, and so on, each having its separate cultural matrix. Even if this diversity could not be denied, the Western studies, particularly the massive social science data generated during the colonial period, fails to adequately demonstrate the strong institutional and normative bonds of unity and linkages among these diversities. In this backdrop, they emerge a different stance in social science approach to cultural discourse in India. The earlier studies were focused on highlighting the bonds of cultural unity. Scholars like N.K. Bose, G.S. Ghurye, Radhakamal Mukherjee studied regional cultures in India and highlighted enduring linkages of cultural values. Bose conducted comparative studies of regional culture by using cultural indicators. So one can say that these social scientists were using comparative historical methods to study Indian culture. After independence in 1947, cultural studies were influenced by the American social anthropology. Robert Redfield, renowned American anthropologist's theory of folk elite and little great tradition stimulated a spate of studies in India. These studies again pointed out the cultural unity in India despite the regional diversities. Along with this, another dominant trend was structural perspective exposed by French sociologist Louis Dumont. He understood the principle of hierarchy in Indian society and culture. During 1980s, when India was gradually moving to the path of liberalization, modernization, the paradigms emerged to study the cultural change and development in India, which established resilience of the many traditional Indian cultural values and institutions for adaptive adjustment in facing up to the challenges of modernity. Moreover, during 1990s, the Anthropological Survey of India undertook a national project on the people of India. This survey also pointed out the cultural unity of India using hundreds of cultural traits. It affirmed that within the existing cultural pluralism in India, there are strong bonds of unity across regions, religions, and communities. Well, you have read about two streams of cultural discourses in India, the socio-historical and social science approach. Within the historical approach, there are two types of cultural discourses, colonial and nationalist discourse. Both of them consist of various different strands. The colonial discourse consists of missionary, Oriental, and utilitarian discourse. Similarly, the nationalist discourse had cultural synthesis, cultural exclusiveness, and cultural protest discourses. Of these discourses, the cultural protest discourse turns out as a critique of both colonial and Brahminical patriarchal nationalist discourse. It questioned the formulation that equates India with Hinduism and advocated an egalitarian cultural discourse. The social science approach, which relied on scientific studies of Indian culture based on field work, also had different positions. Indian culture was studied through comparative historical methods. Along with this, the influence of American anthropology inspired many scholars. The structuralist perspective and modernization paradigm were other strands of social science approach. All these social science approaches primarily highlighted the aspect of unity in diversity of Indian civilization. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions given at the end of the e-text. Thank you very much.